Hello and welcome to Beyond the Headlines. I'm Siddharth Varadarajan, joining you after a break of about a month. Today, the Supreme Court appointed mediation panel sprang a surprise in open court when they informed the bench, headed by Chief Justice Ranjan Gogoi, that they intended to have a second stab at finding some kind of a mediated settlement to the Babri Masjid Ram Janambhoomi dispute in Ayodhya. A month ago, the mediating panel had replied to the Supreme Court that their efforts had reached a dead end. They had, you will recall, been tasked by the Supreme Court with exploring the possibility of the contours of an amicable settlement between the so-called Muslim side to the Ayodhya dispute and the so-called Hindu side. I'm saying so-called because, to my mind, there are wider constitutional issues at stake in the Ayodhya issue, but we'll come to them a little bit later. The panel that the Supreme Court named comprised Justice Khalifullah, a retired judge from Tamil Nadu, the godman, controversial sometimes, Sri Ravi Shankar, and the respected advocate from Chennai, from Madras, Sri Ram Panchu. The choice of mediators seemed a bit odd, although it has to be said that nobody from among the Muslim litigants objected. But normally when you think of mediators and the kind of qualities that they bring, the fact is that an essential condition generally is that a mediator should not have taken a position either way on the subject at hand, that is, he's meant to be mediating. Now here the issue is what happens to this disputed land in Ayodhya. The Hindu side, essentially the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, the wider Sangh Parivar, has asserted that the spot in Ayodhya where the Babri Masjid, which was built in the 16th century, stood until it was demolished by a mob led by Sangh Parivar and BJP leaders in 1992. The VHP insists that that spot is the birthplace of Lord Ram. The Muslim side insists that it has title suit to the land in question, and that the Babri Masjid stood there, and it stood there legitimately and was illegally destroyed, and now a false claim is being made. And you expect that a mediator who is supposed to adjudicate or supposed to find a solution between these two conflicting claims would not have taken his own position on whether there should in fact be a mosque or a temple at that spot. By this yardstick, Sri Ravi Shankar should never have been part of this panel. He has repeatedly in the past said, but most controversially around a year and a half ago, said that the Ayodhya issue needs to be resolved quickly, otherwise there's a danger of becoming another Syria, a reference to a horrible civil war situation in the Middle Eastern country. And he also said that Muslims should give up their claim to that piece of land. Now, so when you have one mediator who's taken a position either way, saying that Muslims should give up that piece of land, it's not clear what role he can play in a panel of mediators. But be that as it may, he was put there by the Supreme Court, perhaps because they thought that he might win the trust of the Hindu litigants. But the fact is that his presence on the panel, to my mind, is probably one of the reasons why the mediation effort in its first innings hit a dead end. That's the one factor that I think the Supreme Court didn't pay enough attention to the composition of the panel. The second problem with mediation, and which is why I'm a little bit skeptical as to whether in its second innings the mediating panel will be able to produce an outcome, is that, or a just outcome, an outcome that would sit well with the constitutional values of India, is that it's essential in any mediation that the process not be vitiated by an atmosphere of bullying. Mediation can happen when both parties to a dispute are roughly equal in terms of their political, in terms of their strength, in terms of their in terms of their confidence in the process. And here it has to be said that given the manner in which the atmosphere has been vitiated over the past few years, with very aggressive claims being made by people in power that mandir wahi banega, that come what may, we are going to create and build a Ram temple at that spot. We saw controversy last week over this statement that Uttar Pradesh Minister Mukut Bihari Verma said कि मंदिर तो बनेगा ही क्योंकि Supreme Court हमारा है. He made that statement, I think it's September last year, but it came to light this year. And the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice, took objection to this kind of statement. But it essentially speaks to the kind of hubris and confidence and aggression with which the Sangh Parivar has been pressing its claims. And pressing its claims to that piece of land and saying we will build a temple come what may. And the fact is that when you are in power, when the supporters of this idea that a temple has to be built at any cost are in power in Uttar Pradesh, when they are in power at the centre, and they day in and day out put forward this view that even if we lose the case, the centre can always come up with an ordinance to build a temple. Somewhere down the line, I think this puts one of the parties to this dispute, the Muslim side, on the back foot, makes them defensive. And I think a further vitiating of the atmosphere which has happened by the communal rhetoric in general. You have a daily barrage of anti-Muslim propaganda, anti-Muslim venom and hate being put out, whether it's on the channels or by different organizations. And recently, no less a person than the Information and Broadcasting Minister of India, Prakash Javadekar, in the context of criticizing Rahul Gandhi's statement on Jammu and Kashmir, which he said was somehow pro-Pakistani, and then he added this gratuitous attack on the Muslims of India by saying that why did Rahul Gandhi say this? Well, it must be the Wayanad effect, making a clear reference to the constituency in Kerala which Rahul Gandhi got elected from, which is, as Narendra Modi told us during the campaign, a constituency where Muslims are in a majority. So when the INV minister uses the platform of a media briefing ostensibly to attack the Congress leader Rahul Gandhi, but then also slips in snide, nasty remarks about Muslims, you can see the kind of atmosphere in the country and how this is not simply, it's simply not conducive to having fair, just mediation and capable, a process in this atmosphere, whether it's going to be capable of producing an outcome that would serve the wider causes of justice and constitutionalism in this country, to my mind, makes it a very, very difficult proposition to argue. The third point I wanted to make is that, for any mediation to succeed, you have to ask, can the parties to the dispute between whom the mediators are mediating be trusted? Now, if you look at the history and the previous activities and statements of the wider Sangh Parivar who are a party to this dispute on the so-called Hindu side, nothing they have said or done over the past 20 years suggests that they can be trusted. And why is trust important? Because, well, if the Muslims are being told through this daily barrage of official statements ki mandir wahan banega hi, if the Muslims are being told that come what may, a temple is going to be made and it's now up to you to decide what best you can extract for your side, because the temple, you cannot prevent the building of the temple. To my mind, within this kind of atmosphere, obviously the Muslim side will want some kind of assurances. We saw reports when the first round of mediation failed that one of the assurances that Muslims wanted was that in the event that a temple comes up in Ayodhya, the VHP and the Sangh Parivar should not press claims to any other places of worship. For example, in the past, the Sangh Parivar people have this slogan, "Ye to abhi jhanki hai, Mathura Kashi baki hai." In other words, they have claims on mosques in Mathura and in Banaras. And I think one of the news reports I read said that the Muslim side wanted an assurance that there would be no further claims. Even that kind of assurance the Sangh Parivar people were apparently unwilling to make. But even if they were to make that claim, there is no guarantee whatsoever that pursuant to any settlement, if not now, then 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 years down the road, whenever it suits the politics of the Sangh Parivar, that this commitment that they supposedly make will be violated. Don't forget that permission to do so-called kar seva at the Babri Masjid precincts in 1992 was granted on the basis of assurances by Kalyan Singh, who was then the Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh, and assurances by the BJP that they would not break the law in any way, that they would, all they intended to do was some peaceful activity. And we saw what came of that promise. We saw the Supreme Court's failure to hold Kalyan Singh accountable for having lied in court. They, I think, found him guilty of contempt of court, but sentenced him to detention only until the rising of the court. So this kind of leniency by the courts, against the backdrop of the fact that the VHP and its wider parivar simply cannot be trusted, to my mind, completely vitiates the mediation process and makes it very difficult to imagine that any just and proper outcome can emerge from this sort of process. Finally, there's a more fundamental question that we need to ask in considering whether or not mediation in its second innings can succeed. And this is a question that has to do with the priorities of the Supreme Court and the priorities of the government, and I dare say the priorities that wider civil society has to think about. A crime was committed when the Babri Masjid was demolished on December 6, 1992. This was a terrible crime against the Constitution, against the people of India, against history. When you have responsible political leaders going to a place, making inflammatory speeches, encouraging a mob to engage in that mindless act of vandalism, and pursuant to that crime, the Central Bureau of Investigation registered a case. There is in fact a serious criminal charges that senior BJP and RSS leaders have to answer, including Lal Krishna Advani and Uma Bharti. That criminal case has been proceeding at a snail's pace. The crime occurred in 1992, that's 27 years ago, and the trial has still not concluded, and despite the Supreme Court directing the trial court to finish the proceedings on an expeditious basis, I think they set a limit of a year, about a year ago, there is no sign whatsoever of that case being prosecuted, and in fact all evidence and information indicates that the Central Bureau of Investigation, which is the prosecuting agency, is actually not particularly interested in prosecuting this case for obvious reasons, because the CBI comes under the control of the Modi government, which is run by a party whose leaders stand accused in the dock. Now, my question is, when you have a criminal case that is pending resolution, why should the title suit be prioritized and set as a case that has to be resolved on an urgent basis? Think about this. Let's say you own a house and your neighbor insists that that piece of land belongs to him, and one day he breaks into your house, murders a family member and destroys the house and then leaves, and then you file a case for murder and for destruction of your property, but there is also a pending title suit between your neighbor and you where your neighbor claims that he has the right to own that piece of land. Wouldn't it be absurd if the courts in this country were to say, hang on a minute, the murder case is less important, the destruction of your house is less important, we will come to that matter later, first we should settle who owns this piece of land. That's exactly what the Supreme Court is doing in this particular case, and to my mind, how they think you can get a just mediation settlement or any kind of resolution of the title suit without first establishing who are these people who demolished that mosque, who are these people who committed that crime, what was the wider conspiracy of which they were a part. Unless these issues are unraveled, to my mind, it would make a mockery of justice to even imagine that you can settle a title suit of the kind that is happening over the Babri Masjid without first resolving these issues of criminal liability. So somewhere down the line, I think the Supreme Court, perhaps there was a lot of, for some reason the Supreme Court has made this a priority, that is, it wants to settle the title suit, even though the criminal case remains unresolved. And to my mind, this is a classic case of putting the cart before the horse. So for all of these reasons, I think that we need to very closely watch not just the ongoing proceedings at the Supreme Court, but the mediation process. And I'm going to close with this, with a final thought. I began my video by saying the so-called Muslim side and the so-called Hindu side. To my mind, this country of 1.3 billion people cannot afford to allow the Ayodhya issue to be looked at purely as a Hindu-Muslim issue on which you have a Hindu side and you have a Muslim side. There are millions and millions of Hindus who were aghast at the manner in which the law was violated and the mosque was demolished by the Sangh Parivar mobs and leaders, and who are demanding that justice be done, and who do not support the position of the VHP for the construction of a Ram temple there at any cost. And I think that it's perhaps incumbent on the mediation panel to open its doors to anybody who wants to make a representation, and to say that whatever outcome comes must not be an outcome that is a product of bullying. It must not be the outcome that is a product of, essentially holding a gun to the head of the so-called Muslim party and ensuring that a temple comes out of the process at any cost, and the only thing left to do is to decide what concessions of one kind or another can be given to the Muslim side to compensate them. I think these are very, very serious issues that go to the heart of Indian democracy and the future of secularism in this country, and it's essential that every Indian think carefully about this and not be seduced by the easy binaries that are being presented to you in the media.